Okay, happy Monday, everybody, and welcome back to Trigger Warning. This is week 2. It's going to be a fun week here at Hunter College. We have no classes for the rest of the week from Wednesday. So today I want to actually talk a little bit about a pretty pressing topic and relevant to what's going on now, and that's immigration. So kind of going to cover a little bit of the history of immigration here in the United States. And then I actually get to talk to a young lady today, Pam, about her story of immigration to the United States from Paraguay and a little bit about her experience with DACA. So to start, I should let everybody know that tomorrow here at Hunter College, that's Tuesday the 19th, there will be a DACA renewal fair, and that's going to be from 9:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. in room 417 in Hunter West. So if you are or know anybody who is a DACA recipient who is documented, please stop by room 417 in Hunter West from 9:30 to 5:30 tomorrow, and they will help you with your DACA renewals. And actually, I believe they are actually covering costs or assisting with the covering of costs for your renewal as well. So definitely a good opportunity to go there and check that out. So I'm going to jump right in. America kind of has a very storied past with immigrants, and anybody really gets generally considered other, how they treat them and the struggle that they have to integrate. Soon after Henry Hudson claimed New York actually for the Dutch East India Company in 1609 and established the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. The Dutch, with the help of Petrus Stuyvesant, who's a name some of us know, started about banning Quakers and Jews and pretty much anybody who was not a Dutch reformist. So that discrimination against the other has kind of been going on for a long time, especially here in the beginnings in New York. These exclusions, of course, though, they didn't apply to slaves and indentured servants. So the British rule actually saw an influx of immigrants coming here to the United States, including about 50,000 convicts that were brought here as part of the Transportation Act of 1717. And then, of course, after the American Revolution, they were sent back off to Australia, which is where some of those jokes come from. And actually, one of the things that was brought to my attention was that it might actually also affect or be one of the reasons why some people in this country have a view of immigrants as criminals. If you think about some of the first immigrants to this country were either slaves or criminals, and the way that they were brought here was in boats. They were dirty, they were smelly, they were prisoners. So something to think about. So the first U.S. Census actually happened in 1790, and at the time the U.S. population was 65% English, 20% of African heritage, and the rest of them were kind of a mix of German, Irish, and Scottish heritage or immigrants. The Naturalization Act notably excludes indigenous peoples, free African Americans, and indentured servants and slaves from getting citizenship. The early to mid 1800s, there was an influx of immigrants to New York, about 3 million actually, in fact, which actually quadrupled the city's population. And at least a third of these were Irish immigrants who were seeking refuge from the potato famine. So then a little bit forward, by 1855, living up to its name as one of the most diverse cities in the country, 50% of New York residents were immigrants. Of course, America responded in kind. This led to kind of nativist sentiments in New York City. So Samuel Morse, yes, that Samuel Morse, who brought us such hits as beep, 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 SOS, if anybody knows the Morse code, he founded the Native American Democratic Association, and I'd like to talk about the threat of corruption of Catholicism and immigrants. One of the things I always found interesting was that they talked about them, or they referred to themselves as Native Americans, which is really in complete ignorance of the true natives that had been murdered and robbed, disenfranchised, left as third-class residents under the Dawes Act, which, though they sold that to the American public as a way to integrate and uplift Native Americans, it was really just a way to lure or force Native Americans from their land with the promise of citizenship, so that the U.S. could claim the tribal lands as excess land and then sell it on the open market to white settlers. This actually eventually led to the loss of all tribe and land titles in Indian Territory, which paved the way for the creation of the state of Oklahoma. Also, to Native Americans losing over 90 million acres of tribal land. And things really haven't improved much since then. But I digress. Thankfully, Morris lost the New York mayoral election, but his ideas later led to the birth of the Know Nothing Party, and that actually expanded the nativist movement. The Know Nothings, however, failed to put either Daniel Webster or their other candidate, who was the former U.S. President, Millard Fillmore, some of us might remember that guy, in the White House. But they did win legislative control of Massachusetts and some other seats around the country. So in 1848, we actually saw our first big wave of Mexican immigrants, about 80,000 of them actually, after the U.S. annexed Texas. That was the end of the Mexican-American War, and Mexico ceded California and the Southwest, much of what we know now as Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, parts of Colorado, and Wyoming. And they are all granted citizenship. Then we discover gold in California, and the California gold rush sparks an influx of Chinese immigrants. So there are a lot of Chinese immigrants, Japanese immigrants coming to the United States. And even as the Civil War is going on, the U.S. offers free or cheap land to anybody who agrees to move out west. This includes immigrants, but really immigrants from Europe, who can now become citizens after 5 years. Meanwhile, the Anti-Coolie Act of 1862 and the Alien Contract Labor Law and the California Foreign Miners Tax were all passed to discourage Chinese and Japanese immigration to California, to fight the lowering of wages, and to prevent them from taking American jobs. That sound familiar to anybody? Oh, they're taking American jobs. Still, the Central Pacific Railroad Company hires Asian laborers, and the Union Pacific hires Irish laborers to construct the first transcontinental railroad, and Europeans and Africans fight in the Civil War. Many of the latter were fighting on the promise of expanded rights and freedoms. So finally, after the war in 1868, the 14th Amendment grants citizenship to freed slaves, and then the 15th Amendment grants voting rights to freed slaves, but still not to Asians or Native Americans. In fact, the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed in 1882 and then got extended twice until 1920. In 1907, the Expatriation Act provided that women could lose their citizenship for marrying aliens. And then California's Alien Land Law in 1913 made it illegal for Asians to own land. Then in 1921, the Emergency Quota Act and the 1924 Immigration Act and the Dillingham Commission capped most immigration, but then favored Western Northern Europeans and even barred Asian immigrants completely. Nobody from Asia was allowed to come here, period. They were not liked. So this, however, opened up immigration from Mexico, from Central and South America, and the Caribbean. So the plan to keep America Anglo actually ended up backfiring by creating an influx of more Latinos, Mexicans, and people from the Caribbean. All this regulation and banning, especially of Asian immigrants, ends up giving birth to commercial smuggling and a rise in illegal immigration. So we create the Border Patrol. Oh, and Congress finally saw fit to grant Native Americans the right to citizenship, although many of them still had no right to vote until 1957. Yep. So during the Great Depression, Roosevelt pretty much shuts down the borders, and we start deporting Mexicans, legal or not, to, again, preserve jobs for white Americans. in what they call a repatriation campaign. That's their term, not mine. So many of the immigrants actually ended up just leaving of their own accord, to the tune of about 1 to 2 million people in this mass exodus. Because, I mean, they didn't want to be here either, especially not while we were scapegoating them, blaming them for loss of jobs and the economy. Then we went to war, and all of a sudden, we were cool with 105 Chinese immigrants coming here annually. Yeah, 105 annually. We also became cool with Mexicans again, because, you know, with a war going on, who's going to work the farms? So after kicking them out a few years earlier, we invite the good people of Mexico back as guest workers in the Bracero program. I'll talk about that a little bit. This is also when we had some of our darkest days, though. So the Naturalization Act I talked about earlier was actually part of this bigger package called the Alien and Seditions Act. And this was really, at the time, all about this perceived French threat. But anyway, the Alien Act allowed the president to deport anyone they felt was a threat or suspected of having treasonous inclinations. And the Alien Enemy Act allowed the president to arrest or banish anyone from the country, any country we declared a war against. So what happened after Pearl Harbor? Well, we deported people of Italian, German, and Japanese heritage, but worse, we actually set up internment camps for over 100,000 Japanese residents. About 60 of them were actually legal residents or citizens. And these people were held from 1942 until 1945 in these internment camps. Fun story, the release was actually delayed just because we didn't want to interfere with Roosevelt's re-election. So I have a really little clip from Roosevelt talking about why this happened.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. Most were loyal. But no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
They would have to move. Now, by they would have to move, we gave them a week to pack their stuff up and move to a internment camp somewhere. And this is what Reagan later had to say about that.
Throughout the war, Japanese Americans in the tens of thousands remained utterly loyal to the United States. Indeed, scores of Japanese Americans volunteered for our armed forces, many stepping forward in the internment camps themselves. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, made up entirely of Japanese Americans, served with immense distinction to defend this nation, their nation. Yet back at home, the soldiers' families were being denied the very freedom for which so many of the soldiers themselves were laying down their lives.
So, to add insult to injury, we actually set up these internment camps mostly on Native American reservations, and then paid them for the inconvenience, even though many of them actually never got paid and ended up later on suing the government to get paid for the use of their land. The war then created refugees, and we took in a couple 100,000 of these refugees. But at first, we actually discriminated against Catholics and Jews, which makes absolutely no sense considering the war that we were just fighting. Then in 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act actually eliminated race completely as a barrier to immigration or citizenship. Japan's quota was actually set to 185 people annually. China's stayed at 105, and other Asian countries were given 100 apiece. We had a real issue with anybody from Asia, it seems. Northern and Western Europe's quota, however, was placed at 85% of all immigrants. And then they placed tighter restrictions on immigrants coming from the British colonies in order to stem the tide of black West Indians entering from Britain. Finally, the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965 ended up eliminating the biased quotas and opened up immigration to all continents. Asian immigration immediately quadrupled, and this was multiplied by the surge of refugees that were coming from the war in Southeast Asia, and of course Cold War refugees from Cuba. This began the brain drain because the U.S. actually offered preference to doctors and scientists and any other skilled professionals. So people started leaving their countries, their homes, to come to the United States for these opportunities. They tweaked the immigration policy some more, and even more after 9/11. And this kind of left us with the piecemeal, convoluted immigration system that we now have today. But I'm sure one of the questions everybody has is, what about all these Mexican immigrants? Well, from the 1920s to around the 1960s, and arguably still to this day, Mexicans had kind of been the main source of agricultural labor in the U.S., building probably the most advanced and successful farming industries in the entire world on their backs. This actually didn't sit well with Mexico, though, who had been trying to grow, trying to modernize their own agricultural businesses and build their economy, period. And during this time, fields would literally sit and rot in Mexico while much of their labor came to the U.S. So in 1942, the Mexican government agreed that in lieu of military support, since they had just also declared war, they would provide border security and legal labor to U.S. farmers. In exchange, the U.S. would tighten immigration enforcement and border patrols and send all illegals back so that they could work in Mexico. The program actually included some guarantees that were important to both countries. They were like wage competition to avoid any labor devaluation in the U.S., military service exemptions, quality of life guarantees, 10% withholding that would go to the Mexican government to be redistributed to the workers later when they returned to Mexico, because we wanted them to return, and then protections for the workers from discrimination and abuses. On paper, the deal actually was quite comprehensive. In reality, however, the Bracero program was typical bureaucracy. Mexico allowed citizens to cross the border with legal labor contracts, but the U.S. only allowed those contracts to be made after the contractor had already legally entered the country. Think about that. This madness, coupled with literacy tests, high immigration natural services costs, and the inability of the program to actually provide enough workers for farmers or to accommodate the number of Mexicans that wanted to work, led to the business of illegal border crossings. Mexico actually was really not happy with this, with the illegal immigration, so the government and Mexican business owners called a meeting in Mexico City with the Department of State, Department of Justice, the Immigration and Naturalization Services, and the Border Patrol in order to put pressure on the U.S. to tighten up enforcement and to impose sanctions on employers of undocumented workers. I hope you all are paying attention right now. Mexico was putting pressure on the United States to tighten up our immigration policy. So, the U.S. put more Border Patrol agents in place. They removed limits on the guest worker visas so they could have more guest workers here legally. They made it a felony to harbor undocumented immigrants, although the Texas proviso made sure it was not illegal to hire these immigrants, because that doesn't count as concealing them. They even made the governments, not the employers, the guarantors of the program in order to curtail abuses. But it didn't help. We would deport people, but they would come right back. And of course, the farmers preferred the cheaper, undocumented workers who were not a part of the Bracero program to those who were in the program. America might dislike immigrants, but we love cheap labor more. And no one seemed to be addressing who was paying to smuggle many of the illegal laborers back here, leading to so many Mexican laborers stuck in servitude, in poor living conditions with low wages and no legal recourse because they were illegal. Eventually, frustrated, the US and Mexico came up with a grand plan. They would send the deportees even further inland. When that didn't work, Mexico took matters into their own hands and sent 5,000 of their own troops to the border to protect the border wall. Well, Eisenhower did not like this because, America does not lose pissing contests. So, in 1954, he appointed this guy, General Joseph Swing, as the INS commissioner. Swing and Company, along with the Mexican government, launched Operation Wetback. I don't think Mexico was part of the naming committee for that one. Some of us remember this clip from the Republican primary debates back in November of 2005, where Donald Trump talks about this.
Let me just tell you that Dwight Eisenhower, good president, great president, people liked him. I like Ike, right? The expression, I like Ike. Moved 1.5 million illegal immigrants out of this country. Moved them just beyond the border, they came back. Moved them again beyond the border, they came back. Didn't like it. Moved them way south, they never came back. Dwight Eisenhower. You don't get nicer, you don't get friendlier. They moved 1.5 million people out. We have no choice. We have no choice.
Now, Trump obviously is oversimplifying what happened, including Operation Wetback, as if, one, it was successful, or two, it was simple. So fact check. Yes, the operation saw over 1 million deportations, actually saw over 1 million people leaving, in addition to voluntary departures for fear of deportation. Mexicans, even some legal immigrants and residents of the United States who were unable to produce birth certificates or other documentation on the spot, were summarily deported deep into central Mexico, many of them far, hundreds of miles from their own homes. Some of the apprehension and transportation conditions were inhumane. There were banana boats and cargo trains. People were left for dead in the deserts of Mexico, dying from heat stroke or just exhaustion. The current Border Patrol that we're familiar with, the way it's set up, is also a result of this Operation Wetback. However, in part due to continued demand for cheap labor and, of course, the failure of either government to address the issues with the Bracero program and the respective labor shortages, illegal border recruitment continued. Operation Wetback, thankfully that's the last time I have to use that term during this broadcast, was largely a failure, save for the backroom deals that Border Patrol made to get more workers onto the Bracero program officially, making them legal. In fact, if the numbers tell it, voluntary departures from the U.S. during the period from 1946 to 1952 were actually 10 to 20 times higher on average than deportations. It means more people were leaving than were being deported. Eventually, after failing to curtail the flow of illegal crossings, or the farmers' abuses, or the complaints from men returning from war now and looking for jobs, claiming that their jobs were being taken, the U.S. just gave up on the Bracero program with no replacement. But what happened when the program ended? You think all these immigrants and the migrant workers just kind of left after 1965? Nope. You think the new labor relationship, the trade relationship and the demands for the workers and the migration patterns just stopped? No. They kept going, legal or not. The H-2B seasonal visa program was in place by then with worker caps on how many people we could have. But what happened when you came, you worked, you had a baby, you started a life and a family in the United States? Well, in 1986, the Immigration Reform Act actually gave all 3 million immigrants amnesty as long as they had been here since at least 1982 and met other requirements, obviously. But what about the others that weren't here since 1982, that came after 1982, who were not here for the 5 years, and those were still to come? We still had no solution for that. And the 90s economic boom made immigrating to the U.S. even more desirable. Then the 2000s saw 9/11, tighter restrictions, anti-immigrant sentiment again, and the recession. And again, many immigrants just left. People were leaving because it wasn't worth it to be here anymore. But those who now had family ties stayed. President Obama actually expanded what's called Secure Communities. It's a DHS initiative where local police and jails actually submit arrestees' fingerprints to federal and criminal and immigration databases, and then turning these undocumented immigrants over to the Immigration and Naturalization Services for deportation. So about 1.5 million people were deported, including 400,000 people in 2012 alone. People think Obama was actually soft on immigration. He actually his administration ramped up immigration enforcement a lot. And the apprehension of Mexicans that were illegally crossing the border during that time actually fell to only about 230,000 in 2014, which is the lowest level it had been at since 1971. The thing is, though, that today, even though Mexicans still make up about half the immigration population, it's mostly family-based, not single males as it used to be. And about half of the adult immigrants have U.S.-born children, what people call anchor babies sometimes. Half of them didn't sneak in. They came here legally and overstayed. So this isn't just a Mexico border issue anymore. This is an immigration policy issue. It's some solution that we need to have that's much more comprehensive. In 2001, a month before 9/11, we tried that. Senators Durbin and Hatch introduced what's known as the DREAM Act, and here Obama talks a little bit about that.
Imagine you've done everything right your entire life. Studied hard, worked hard, maybe even graduated at the top of your class, only to suddenly face the threat of deportation to a country that you know nothing about, with a language that you may not even speak. That's what gave rise to the DREAM Act.
Now, the DREAM Act allowed immigrants who came to the U.S. at 16 years or younger, who had a high school diploma or GED, and had no criminal record, to apply for conditional residence. Then after 6 years, and with either proof of military service of 2 years or minimum, or a post-secondary education, and then of course more background checks, they could apply for permanent residence. Now this effectively put them at the back of the green card line and required additional qualifications on top of what you would normally go through. It was in no way an amnesty or a grant of citizenship. The bill failed in the Republican Congress from 2001 to 2006 a number of times, and then in the Democratic-controlled Congress, and then again in 2010. President Obama finally decided to take matters into his own hands and issued an executive order in 2012 instituting what we now know as DACA, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This is Obama talking about DACA.
Effective immediately, the Department of Homeland Security is taking steps to lift the shadow of deportation from these young people. Over the next few months, eligible individuals who do not present a risk to national security or public safety will be able to request temporary relief from deportation proceedings and apply for work authorization.
Now, to be fair, deferred action as a concept was already a thing that savvy lawyers and immigrants already knew about. It didn't grant legal status or work authorization then, but it actually deferred deportation. So lawyers would bring their clients in, they would talk to the judges, the immigration judges, and they would say, okay, your client's low risk, they're good people, they're in school, give them some time. Didn't, again, give them any kind of status at all, just time before they were deported. They were low priority. DACA created a system. It had fees that were about $500. Now it's $495 for your filing fee and $85 for your biometrics. They call you fingerprinting, etc. And it created documentation as well as a system of enforcement. Now we knew who was who. Now we knew what immigrants were here. They were not off the radar anymore. We could monitor them. The program also had many of the same requirements of the DREAM Act, but effectively just delayed deportation and gave Dreamers a student or work visa, not a path to even residency. DACA was an imperfect response to what Obama himself called congressional inaction. It has loopholes, some of which lawyers learned to take advantage of, actually, to create a path to permanent residency. It exempted Dreamers from federal financial aid, from welfare, including food stamps, and from Medicaid. But it provided hope for a lot of people. On September 5th, Trump and the Justice Department announced an end to DACA via a 6-month wind down, which was set to expire on March 5th, 2018.
Good morning. I'm here today to announce that the program known as DACA that was effectuated under the Obama administration is being rescinded. The DACA program was implemented in 2012 and essentially provided a legal status for recipients for a renewable 2-year term, work authorization, and other benefits, including participation in the Social Security program to 800,000 mostly adult illegal aliens. The policy was implemented unilaterally to great controversy and legal concern after Congress rejected legislative proposals to extend similar benefits on numerous occasions to this same group of illegal aliens.
Now, aside from the language that Jeff Sessions used to describe these immigrants and these documented young folks, the administration essentially just passed the buck to Congress again, who had failed, like he said, quote unquote, refused so many times to pass the DREAM Act, and eventually left many dreamers now wondering what's next. Today, I speak to one such dreamer who's agreed to share their story, and that's Pam. Here with Pam. Say hi, Pam.
Hi.
Pam and I were trying to do this interview 3 times, talking about her experience coming to the United States from Paraguay. And up until now, Pam's a DACA recipient, an immigrant, and has dealt with the ins and outs of the U.S. immigration system. So I have her here today to tell a little bit of her story. So introduce yourself, Pam, and then tell us a little bit about you.
All right, so like he said, I'm Pamela. I'm a sophomore here. I'm a double major in Women and Gender Studies and Sociology, and I also work at the Welcome Center as a tour guide. So to start my story off, I came to the U.S. when I was 5. We came on a tourist visa, just like most, well, not most, a lot of immigrants come that way. I came with my mother. My dad came ahead of us, just so it wouldn't be too suspicious of us traveling together. We've been living in Flushing, Queens ever since then. I've never known anything besides the Chinatown in Queens. I love it there. So when we came here on a tourist visa, our visa became void once I was enrolled in school, because you're not allowed to do that on a tourist visa. So that became void then. And then obviously I stayed past the 6 months permit that you get on your visa to be in the U.S. So again, that's when I really became under no status, what we like to say undocumented. Yeah. So that's kind of like where my journey begins. It never really affected me. Well, obviously it did, but I never noticed.
Yeah, did you know you were undocumented?
I did know.
Okay.
But I didn't know what it was. I just knew that my mom was like, oh, we're not citizens, we're not Americans, so we can't do certain things, we can't travel outside, this and that. And I didn't really know why, but I was just like, okay.
But even at, I guess, 5, 6, 7, you knew that there was something
different.
There were restrictions for you. There was something different.
There was restrictions. The main thing was that we couldn't leave the country, and that's what affected me most, because we have no family here. Mm-hmm. All my extended family is back in Paraguay, so that was like a big hit for me as a child to be suddenly I have nobody. So it was really difficult growing up, because it was just my parents and I. They're not antisocial, but because they work so much, they don't have that time to socialize. Right. So it really is just my parents, myself and my sister, who was born here. So she's like the citizen in our family. We're all waiting for her to turn 21 so she can petition for us. I'm hoping I can wait that long.
Okay.
So yeah. We've been living here ever since. The whole thing of my status and being undocumented, when it really hit me, at least I want to say face to face, was when in middle school, when everyone started getting their working permits. So when you're 13, 14, you can get your working permits from the guidance counselor. And I went with my friends and I asked my counselor, I was like, can I get my working papers? But I don't have a social security number. He goes, oh. He's like, no. And that year, I remember DACA was denied, wasn't passed.
Right.
They tried to pass it. And he's like, I'm sorry, but they tried to pass it. And even in New York State, the Senate, they didn't pass it. He's like, I'm sorry, but if they pass it next year, you can get your working permit.
Now, which year was this?
I think it was like 2012, 11-ish.
So this is when, I guess, the DREAM Act was making its way through the House and the Senate, and getting denied over and over again.
Over and over and over again.
Yeah, I remember back in 2001 when they first introduced the DREAM Act, and praying for it to pass. So I can imagine. So you were now 14, trying to get your work permit, and witnessing this in New York. And how did that affect you, your relationship with your friends, or even with your family at that time?
I didn't tell my friends. I'm just like, I'm not a citizen, but they just assumed that I was a resident, you know. But they're like, they didn't pay any mind. I didn't want to attract attention to it, so I just told them that I just couldn't work. I was like, my parents won't let me work. They're like, okay. And I went home and I told my mom, I'm like, I can't work. And she goes, I know. Neither can I. And then I was just getting so upset, and sometimes my mom has these moments of like, well, we should just go back because we're not doing anything here anyways. And
frustration.
And her frustration hit, and then it affected me, and I started like doubting everything in my life. Like, what are we doing here? What am I doing here? Am I wasting my time? Is it worth it? And it's like these like crisis moments that I'm having more often these days. But that's when I first had, like, when I sat down with myself and I'm like, what the fuck is going on? And what am I going to do with my life? Do I even have a future if I can't work? I was like, how am I supposed to pay for school? Like, I want to go to college, and it's all these things. And when you're like 13, 14, like, that's not what most 13-year-olds worry about. Like,
shouldn't be at all.
It's more like, what color is my lip gloss? Like, does Daniel like me or not? Like, what's going on? Like, why won't Tiffany invite me to her sleepovers? Like,
we have to talk a little bit more about Daniel and Tiffany. On another show. I'm gonna have to come eat. So, did you have a strong relationship or communication with family back home in Paraguay at the time?
I didn't. I lost all my. I'm kind of like estranged from my family, not on purpose. But it was before, smartphones and Facebook and WhatsApp. So it was like you bought like the calling card, the Boss Revolution, and you called them, and you had like 20 minutes to talk.
8 cents a minute.
Yeah, 8 cents a minute. And so I mostly spoke to my grandma a little bit from time to time, and then it became for like birthdays only, or like Christmas maybe, and then it just died down to nothing.
How did it affect you then when your mom talked about going back? How did you feel about the idea? I mean, despite the fact that you were afraid of your future here, how did you feel about the prospect of going back to a country that you didn't really have the same connection when you were 5 years old?
I didn't want to. I was scared. I'm like, but they have nothing there. It's just like cows and planes. Well, that's what But I was like, it's not the same. Like, I'm more comfortable. I feel more comfortable in English, even though it's my second language. Like, I don't know these people, but also like I hate it seeing my mom have these like kind of nervous breakdowns, and I'm like, and then you feel responsible for it because they're always like, oh, we're here for you to have a future, and you're like, I'm sorry.
So that they were open with telling you that the main reason they were here was kind of in order to kind of make a better future for you, for themselves also, but especially for you as their child.
Of course, it starts off for themselves and me adjacent. But then at one point, I think most immigrant parents realize that they're not going to achieve the dream they came for, so they kind of pass down the torch to their children. And now, like, a lot of us feel like the weight of the world, like, we have to make sure that all these sacrifices were worth it. Yeah, so sometimes it's really hard to deal with that.
So 2012, when Obama finally announced the executive order putting DACA in place. Where were you then, and how did that make you feel? How did that go for you? Did you take advantage of it immediately? Did you guys discuss it?
My parents were really excited for it, and I was excited too. But I needed to be 15 to apply,
Right.
and I wasn't 15 yet. I was like 14 still, and so my parents are like, "You have to wait." And I was like, "Damn!" I'm like, "I want it now. I want to work now." And they're like, "We know." So I had to wait, but I was really excited, and I was just like, "This is it. Like this, I'm gonna be like a normal person now. Like I can work at Walgreens and like get my money." And it was just very exciting for me that I could get a job,
Yeah.
without like having to worry or think, "Oh, like I can't work these certain type of jobs
Right.
because they require like Social Security and all that jazz." So it was very I want to say like hopeful, and like I thought, okay, now I can have a future.
Yeah.
That's how I felt. Like before, I felt like I have no future here,
And what did you, I guess, before that and then after that, what were your plans for your future at 13? And then how did that change, if it did at all, at 14, 15, when you finally knew that, you could maybe do the things that you wanted to do then?
At 13, I didn't have that many plans. I just knew that I wanted to go to college somewhere far away, dorm, away from home. But that's all I knew. But then those plans are in jeopardy for me because that was before DACA.
Right.
But then with DACA, and I'm like, wow, I have the chance to go to school and work and get money for it and study. I mean, that was before I knew that DACA didn't give you any financial aid. So I'm like, in the end,
Right.
DACA did help a little, but it didn't help a lot. Like I get no financial aid from the government, so I had to rely on private scholarships, third-party scholarships, which I'm very fortunate to be a recipient of, the Dream.us, which is a national scholarship program that provides, I think about $25,000. They just raised it a little bit to students, to DACA recipients and TPS recipients to go to school.
Right.
And there's like probably very, very little programs like this that exist, and they're very hard to find unless accounts are in your school or like somebody that's part of it. But you yourself, like, they're like, nobody's ever gonna come here and tell you, it's like, are you undocumented? Here's a list of resources. You don't get that.
Yeah, and luckily in New York we have a lot of resources for that, and Hunter College, I know, offers a lot. I mean, the CUNY system with Citizenship Now definitely has a lot of resources for that. And so then what brought you to Hunter after all of this?
So after a very traumatizing college application process, because of me worrying of where am I going to get money to go to school, I don't have money to go to school. Even CUNY's like paying out of pocket was really expensive.
Right.
But thanks to DACA, I qualify for in-state tuition. Without DACA, I wouldn't qualify for it. So I'd have to pay like, what is it, like $16,000, which is crazy. With DACA, I was like, okay, at least I can afford in-state tuition. Then I got my scholarship, and I was like, this is enough. The program, at least within New York, only went to was only affiliated with CUNY schools.
Right.
So I can go to any CUNY that I wanted to. So I decided to Hunter because that was like the best one.
And what was the process like for you? I mean, once you finally were able to apply for DACA, because I think there are some, just like with the adjustment status to getting your green card, think it's just, oh, I go in and I sign up for this thing. But what was the process really like from start to finish for you? I mean, like cost-wise, time-wise, what did that involve for you?
It was a little, we went to a couple of lawyers first, trying to see which one had the best price, which one was free, blah, blah, blah. They're mostly in like Brooklyn, located in like church basements.
Right.
And they do like a lot of like either really to low cost or free immigration like work. So once I finally found a lawyer that was recommended by one of my neighbors who's also a DACA recipient, who's like a year older than me, so she did her process first. So she sent me to this lawyer in Brooklyn, and every time you visit them, it's $65, which is not a lot comparing to like a lot of other places and how lawyers usually charge. And then when it first started out, I think it was like $450. Now it's $500.
It's $495 plus the $85 fee for the fingerprinting and stuff.
Yeah, it's crazy expensive. But it wasn't as expensive back then, but it was still a little bit on the pricier side. But my parents are like, this is important. Like, we can't be cheap on this. Like, we have to pay the fee. And I was like, obviously. So the paperwork, it was a little bit interesting. I had to go to the Social Security office, and my dad was a little scared to go in. Because their immigration officers there, and they could like literally just stop you right there.
Because you get DACA, but it doesn't help your parents.
It doesn't help my parents at all. And I didn't even have DACA yet. I was just going to fill out paperwork. My dad didn't want to go in, but I was underage, so an adult had to sign for me. And so he went in, and we were a little nervous. I remember there was a huge like blizzard, and it was disgusting. It was a mess. It was gross. And after that, it was kind of just like I got my Social Security in the mail, and then I got like after I did my biometrics, I finally got my card. That beautiful little blue and red card that I love so much, and I got so excited, and it just meant so much to me to get that little stupid piece of plastic. And I was like, this is it. This is my ticket. This is my ticket to the world. This is my first step into like having a life and being like an American and like just like living. Yeah. So.
You talk about that fear with your parents. I mean, first of all, how long did the process take from when you filed the paperwork until you finally started to get documents?
I think about 2 months.
2 months.
Just because it takes the people a while to process them.
Yeah. And then your parents have to sign, you said. So at this point, you talk about this, the fear that your father had. Because, I mean, you can't fill out the forms all by yourself. So you're putting all your information down and their information down, right? Did they give you any guarantees that, hey, even though your father is putting all this information down, he doesn't have to worry? Or was that still something that was a fear or is a fear to this day?
It was a fear, but we weren't going to be like, oh, my dad's undocumented, is that a problem? But I did ask my lawyer, can I go alone? And she said, no, your dad has to go and he has to sign for you. But she's like, he'll be fine. She's like, don't worry, they're not going to ask for anything. She's like, relax. I was like, okay. And then when I had to renew it 2 years later, and I was 17, so I wasn't 18 yet. I was almost 18. So I still had, my dad still had to go with me, and that one, he was scared too, because this one was like an actual immigration office. It wasn't just a Social Security place. And there were like immigration officers like scanning people like with the metal detectors. And then my dad's like, he's like, I'm gonna wait for you outside. And then I go inside and I get checked in, and she's like, you're 17, where's your parent? And I was like, oh, he's outside. She's like, well, he needs to be in here. And I'm like, fuck. So I was like, you have to come in here. He was like, oh shit, okay. And it was like 10 seconds, so intense. That officer, I'm like, don't make eye contact, don't look at him, don't breathe, just take your jacket off.
Be an American, be an immigrant.
Be an American, don't speak, don't let them hear your accent. Like, it was like 10 seconds of fear, because you never know when they just might like be feeling bored and be like, can I see your ID or whatever? So then, yeah. And after that, I renewed it again a couple of months ago in July, and I can go by myself now. But it was like an intense 10 seconds for me. And my dad, too. Because you never know. Yeah.
Now, you say your sister she was born here. She is a citizen. Your parents are still in their status. What's the relationship like? You've got a household with
mixed
a
status,
citizen, a DACA recipient, and no status. And how does that? I mean, how do each of your lives differ, and how does the relationship change when you got your DACA and now that you're waiting for your sister? You said to turn 21. How does that affect your relationships?
Well, I think in general, when you're first generation, you come to your parents, you become the bridge between your parents and like whatever country you go to.
Yeah.
So I was always the bridge, the translator, the mediator, the negotiator, the everything. And then when I added DACA, it was like more on me because I was the one that like had some sort of legal status that would allow me to like integrate myself more into society. My parents like, you're gonna do this, you're gonna do that, you're gonna get your residency and then citizenship like eventually, and then you're gonna give it to us. And with my sister, it's not on her that much because she's little, she's 11. So my parents, like, they don't want to wait for her 10 more years. We've been waiting 14 years for something. And so it's mostly on me. But my sister, she understands and she knows because we have to tell her. And it makes her really upset sometimes. Like, when DACA got canceled and she thought I was going to get deported immediately. She started crying. I was like, and then that made me cry. And then she's like, I'm like, no, they're not gonna. I was like, it's okay. I'm not gonna leave you. She got so scared because what they do is like they'll keep the U.S. citizen child here, and then they'll like deport like the rest of the family. That's like my biggest fear. If I get deported, fine. You don't want me here, I'm gonna leave. But like my sister, like that's my biggest fear. My sister getting left behind or being taken away from me, like me getting kicked out, like, okay, I'll just go and I'll start over somewhere else. But like that, like I can't be apart from my sister for like a weekend. So like I just can't. That's my biggest fear.
I mean, I can imagine it's a lot for her. I mean, at 11 years old, that's a lot of emotional distress to take on. I mean,
she is, and she's such a tiny little person to hold that much stress in her body, and she's very educated on what's going on. Like I try to educate her, make sure that she knows what's going on because she's gonna start hearing things at school because kids hear stuff from their parents and they don't know, so they just repeat whatever and add their own like random like 6th grader crap. And so I want her to become educated, and she goes, I tell people, I try to educate them when they're wrong because I don't want them to be ignorant and racist and dumb like that stupid president. She gets so angry. And from one part it's good, but it's also like too much stress on that little girl.
Might be a future advocate, though.
She might be. I'm kind of excited. I created like this little revolutionary in my house, which is nice.
That's thank you for sharing that story. I mean, it's illustrates kind of the reality of how much, these things don't just affect one person. It's not just your parents. It's not just even you. Even though it's their decisions affecting you and now also affecting your 11-year-old sister. And I think that's kind of the idea that I wanted to get across, even before knowing your story, knowing that this is a fairly common theme amongst immigrant families, with whether they're DACA recipients or not, but people who've been here for 14 years waiting for another 10 years for an 11-year-old to maybe be able to help them one day.
Maybe.
And the fact that people are there who are willing to go through that, to wait that long, to see a better life for themselves, for their kids, I think is something that I think America needs to remember and address. And so thanks.
Well, thank you for having me.
Stir up some conversation today.
Yes.
Well, I'll have to definitely get you back in and
I'd love to come back.
Archive some more of the story.
Yes.
Thanks again.
Yeah.
I want to thank everybody here at WHCS Radio and Pamela for coming in and talking to us about her story a little bit today. I want to remind everybody again that tomorrow we will be doing DACA renewals here, DACA renewal clinic here at Hunter College in room 417 in Hunter West from 9:30 to 5:30. And having heard some of the stories of immigrants who are here and the lives that they live and the people that they are, I wanted to leave with one last segment, a little quote from Ronald Reagan. This was when he actually signed a bill giving money payments actually to Japanese who has families had been interned during this time. And this is what Reagan had to say.
And one young actor said, "Blood that is soaked into the sands of a beach is all of one color. America stands unique in the world, the only country not founded on race, but on an ideal. Not in spite of, but because of our polyglot background, we have had all the strength in the world. That is the American way." The name of that young, I hope I pronounced this right, was Ronald Reagan.
Thanks for listening, folks.